Good morning, everybody, and welcome back once again to this live stream where I'll be discussing today two aspects of the Spectator Papers. The first being the middle style of Addison, and the second is the periodical essay, especially the Spectator Papers, and its role in the formation of the early public sphere in England. So these are the two issues that I shall take up in slightly separate discussions uh, throughout this hour's uh, uh, throughout this hour's interactions. Now, let me quickly move on to the question of the middle style, and I would, of course, like to project at this point of time some of the comments that I am making so that they are visible to you right away. So this is what the middle style is all about. And I am going to argue that Addison is going to describe, or Addison is going to bring in uh, a new kind of a prose style after Bacon and before Lamb, a style that is both distanced and intimate, that is both conversational and civil. And this is what we will call the middle style of Addison. Of course, I'm borrowing here, as many of you uh, can see from the uh, the link there, the PowerPoint there. The middle style was a term which was used by Dr. Johnson. And Dr. Johnson, while referring to this middle style, talks about Addison's prose on grave subjects, not formal, on light occasions, uh, not grovel, pure without scrupulosity, extra without any apparent elaboration, always equable and always tempted. He performed, he's never feebler, did not wish to be energetic, he's never rapid, and he never stagnates. His sentences have neither are not diligently rounded, are voluble and easy. So Addison, I'm sorry, Dr. Johnson is very clear. This is recorded by Boswell in the life of Johnson. He suggests that Addison is neither grave nor formal. So he is serious without being overtly sermonic. Once again, let me go back to that quotation. He's blending the morality with wit. On light occasions, not grovelly. Yet at the same time, whenever he's engaging in banter, humor, irony, that does not become important in itself. So a certain check is always kept. That is to say, the essays do not allow us to forget that they are serious essays, pure without scrupulosity. So the English that Addison uses, the style that Addison uses, is largely one which is grammatically and conversationally correct without being excessively formal. And there are embellishments without any elaboration. So there is humor, there is irony, there is description, but none of them sort of uh, take precedence over the other. So what what Dr. Johnson is probably trying to highlight is how Addison walks a middle path between seriousness and entertainment. The other point that he's making is that Addison's essays are always civil in the sense that he never loses his poise, neither is he very critical, nor is he absolutely praising any institution. He is never rapid, so there's nothing very energetic about the essays. It is a languid pace, but he never stagnates. But the essays never stop, they go on at their own pace. Whoever wishes to attain an English style, Addison Johnson maintains, familiar but not coarse. Now that's a very interesting turn of phrase, isn't it? Familiar. It is intimate with the audience, but it is never very, as you can say, colloquial, or it isn't very intimate. And elegant, but not ostentatious. It is elegant, but it does not provide us with any grave morality, or it is not very florid in its style, must give it his days and nights to the volumes of Addison. Right, so coarse and elegant, not coarse and elegant, but not ostentatious, must give his days and nights to the volumes of Addison. So that's where the term middle style actually comes from. Now, let me observe how, Addison achieves this concept of the middle style, as it were. Now, the important phenomenon here is to see what is the audience to which the style is directed, what is the purpose of Addison's essays, and therefore how does the style suit this purpose of Addison. These are the three questions that I'm going to put forward before you. Now, as Addison has consistently pointed out, that his readership is upper middle class, right, and also to the civilized ladies. Therefore, very importantly, Addison is going to use a style which is sophisticated to a certain extent, but he does not want a very sophisticated literary style. Why? This comes back to the purpose. His purpose, of course, as we pointed out in our earlier discussions, is to make philosophy easier, is to make more complex social problems easily accessible to his reading public, bring philosophy out of closets and libraries to dwell among clubs and coffee houses, is what he suggests. Therefore, his subject matters will be taken from social concerns, literary issues, political issues to a certain extent, but he will be presenting them to the audience in a simplified version. At the same time, he has to have the moral and literary authority to write upon these subjects. Therefore, Addison must cultivate, or Addison has to cultivate a style that is both literary and without being overtly, stylistic, as it were. Therefore, what does he do? He therefore begins his essays very clearly with a quotation from a classical source. It might be Virgil, it might be Horace, it might be Catullus, it might be Tully. And very often, as we saw in Sir Roger in Love, what Addison also does is very frequently he uses a classical anecdote. For example, he uses the classical anecdote about Nevia in Sir Roger in Love. You remember Nevia can only be talked about by the lover, and when he writes to his father, he signs, "I am my Nevia, forever thine." Right. So Addison therefore situates very clearly at the very beginning of the essay his literary style within the classical, right? And this gives him, why does he do this? This gives him the moral authority, a kind of a literary authority, a kind of garb of sophistication And the Spectator has already suggested, as we pointed out in the earlier lecture, that he's well read and well traveled. Therefore, it gives him the authority to comment on social affairs. So the first component of the literary style is his learning and very frequent references to the classical sources. Now, the other thing that he does, of course, and we will remember that he wants to temper wit with morality, and he will provide small doses to bring the audience out of the rut into which they have fallen. Therefore, he tutors his readers, as the slide goes, refines critical terms, and instills principles of good taste as well as fine judgment. The essays are philosophical and highly literate, but also well bred, in the sense that they also create this temper of civility, this garb of strict neutrality, this temper of civility, the ability to comment on public affairs, and also with the classical authority, the position that the Spectator claims for himself as a kind of a commentator on the affairs of men. So wherever there are human affairs, human affairs in the sense that there are human concerns, the Spectator is at hand to comment. So there is a distinct element of learning. However, Addison also does not want this classical learning to intrude upon the essays themselves too much. Therefore, what he does is he initiates a conversational tone within the essays, right? And he draws the reader in with the, almost first-person conversational tone of the Spectator. A spectator who is not too judgmental, a spectator who is an observer, a spectator who invites comments from the reader and encourages interaction. So the second aspect of the style, of the middle style, is his conversational tone. But I pointed out in my earlier lecture also that whilst the conversational tone is to be used, there is a certain distance that the Spectator maintains from the audience. He's very reticent, and very often the Spectator pronounces his opinion and suggests it as a moral caveat, right? So there is a narration which is told in a conversational way, an anecdote, an encounter with Sir Roger, for example, and then comes a narrative caveat, a kind of a moral caveat, rather, where Addison will suggest, of course, how superstitions can be rid of, how the country can rid of their ideas about witches, and so on and so forth. Therefore, there is this tight balance in the style. The style, when it comes to the narrative component, is ironic, humorous, and very often intimate. It becomes a kind of a conversation. But in the part of the essay where the narrative judgment or the moral judgment is passed on the affairs of society, where Addison is trying to refine the public sphere, as it were, the tone and the style of the essay suddenly becomes more sermonic and more advisory than conversational, right? More advisory than conversation, right? So this is the kind of alteration and continuous shift in the style that Addison handles as he discusses the public sphere in his essays. Now, this is to be contrasted with Steele's essays in The Spectator. Steele's essays is rooted in local experience, uses more importantly phenomenon of daily life, city tradesmen, gang of London toughs called the Mohawks. So Steele's narrative style is more reportage, whilst Addison's style is intimate yet advisory. Right. So between the two of them, they bring both the news into the Spectator Papers as well as the social commentary and advisory within the texts. Addison uses a more Latinate language purged of common cant. That's something that I pointed out, how he uses classical allusions. The number of classical allusions that Addison uses in his essays is surprisingly large. Right. Now, in Spectator 285, Addison makes an important point on style. He says, since it often happens that the most obvious phrases and those which are used in ordinary conversation become too familiar to the ear and contract a kind of meanness by passing through the mouths of the vulgar, a poet should take particular care to guard himself against idiomatic ways of speaking. The great masters in composition know very well that many an elegant phrase becomes improper for a poet when it has been debased by common use. Therefore, Addison is moving away from the cliches, right? Is cultivating a style that is not very colloquial, not very idiomatic, and not extremely debased. Is using a style that is much more refined, that is filtered through a literary consciousness. Right. And let me get back once again. Shevern points out that Steele's prose never attained the elegant ease and correctness of Addison's. Right. But Steele was much more intimate in his description in the Spectator Papers. Right. And it is therefore that Addison was often compared, probably a little in a hyper way by Alexander Pope, to almost Virgil. Right. Almost Virgilian in the sense of his rather sophistication, elegance, and very often a turn of phrase. Now, let me get back to the comment about Addison here. This and get back to Addison's praise by Dr. Johnson. Now, what are the components, therefore, of this middle style? The first, as we have said, is Addison's civility. Now, how does this civility come through in the Spectator Papers? Let's take an essay like Sir Roger at Home, for example. Now, when Addison describes Sir Roger at home, he is or Sir Roger at church is describing this old gentry with repeated kind of metaphors of old age. For example, the butler is old, the old house dog is retired, Sir Roger is on the verge of death, and so on and so forth. Right. Therefore, even if he's talking about the decay of a kind of a life, Addison is very polished. He's balancing it with Sir Roger's generosity, with Sir Roger's intimate interaction with his subjects. And once again, remember, Addison describes Sir Roger as an eccentric character, extremely pompous, conscious of his position, rises up in church during a sermon, but he does not allow the humor to degenerate into any kind of vitriolic satire. Right. So he immediately balances the irony and the humor with a kind of a praise. So I might argue that part of the style or part of the aspect of the style of Addison is to balance the humor and irony and satire with immediate praise. And this is the tone of civility. Now, contrast this with, say, a text like Macflecknoe, where Dryden brutally demolishes Shadwell and his ilk. Right? Shadwell never deviates into sense. That's an absolutely critical demolition of a character. Irony working devastating. Addison uses the irony. He uses the humor. There is laughter directed at Sir Roger. We laugh at his eccentricities. This laughter is a sympathetic laughter. And Addison seems to, moderate immediately the criticism with the reference to Sir Roger's, failure in love and the sort of whims of the perverse widow, which has led him to such an eccentric behavior, as it were. Therefore, there's a tight balance in the Spectator Papers between laughter on the one hand and sympathy on the other. So it's a sympathetic laughter that Addison is generating. Right. Also important is this discourse and style of civility. The Spectator never intrudes, never criticizes very brutally any aspect of society. He merely advises. So the tone of civility that we witness in the Spectator Papers, in the Spectator Club, is equally observable in the presentation of the middle style in Addison's Spectator Papers. Now, there are other kinds of elements that Addison also uses in the Spectator Papers. And let me stop sharing here my presentation so that I can quickly move on to the other aspect of my talk, as it were, is how Addison uses how Addison blends this element of reportage and the concept of the narrative gloss. Now, if we look at that essay that Addison writes in number 49, which I very frequently have referred to you, he begins this essay with a kind of a commentary, right? He says, "It is very natural for a man who is not turned for mirthful meetings to delight in that sort of conversation which we find in coffee houses. Here, a man of my temper is in his element, for if he cannot talk, he can be still more agreeable as well as pleased in himself in being only a hearer." If you look at that sentence, it's a slightly longish sentence, but it briefly introduces a subject, right? And then he talks about the different times of the day and the different kinds of people who entered into the coffee house. Here, the tone is more conversational, narrative, light, chips here and there, uses irony and humor. So one would think that these young virtuosos take a gay cap and slippers to be in signs of dignity, for the vain things approach each other with an air which shews they regard one another for their vestments. So here is irony, right? So a kind of a formal tone immediately followed by a light ironic tone, right? And then he moves on to the concept of the coffee house as a place where different kinds of human beings can fruitfully interact, right? So when Ebullus seems to intimate that things go well, the company they speak and act after him are wise in his sentences, and no sooner sat down at their own tables, but they hope or fear, rejoice or despond, as they saw him do in the coffee house. So this fictional character called Ebullus, who is somebody whom people looks up at in the coffee house, he immediately leads to the formation of opinions within the public sphere, and people seek to imitate him, right? So imitating a good man then therefore becomes a polite behavior in society. So what have we looked? We've got three distinct styles in one essay. In the first segment, it is introductory and it is formal. Immediately later on, the style becomes more playful, intimate, conversational, uses irony and humor, but never allows it to degenerate into satire. In the final section, the prose becomes more advisory, the style becomes once again formal and more moral in its dimension. Right. Therefore, the middle style is not just one literary style. The middle style is Addison's interplay or Addison's use of different kinds of style that he uses in the periodical essay. The second aspect, the other aspect that I would like to mention here is therefore uh, the kind of metaphors and allusions that Addison uses. Now, there are two distinct categories of metaphors. One which refers to the classical allusions and the classical metaphors, and the other is the set of contemporary allusions and metaphors. For example, in the ghosts and superstitions, the way in which Addison will use the metaphor of the dead horse and the rider who rides on the dead horse being visualized by the maid who then slips his pail of milk and then runs away in hysteria is a very contemporary, is drawing upon contemporary real objects in his articulation of the metaphor. Whilst when he's talking about more classical sources, when he's talking about, say, essay number 10, when he's talking about himself as the bringer of a kind of a modern Socrates, as it were, he is therefore going back to more classical sources. Right. So even in his use of metaphors, even in his use of allusions, Addison has a kind of a flexibility and a wider range. Now, the style, of course, also is moderated by the presence of different registers. And this is true, especially in the essays on Sir Roger in Love and in Sir Roger in The Death of Sir Roger. So, if need be, Addison can quickly slip into the romantic, a kind of a romantic prose where you have the handsome Sir Roger dashing across the meadows, the same Sir Roger suddenly falling in love and losing his bearings, right? This Sir Roger wistfully remembering his days of youth. So the register and the style of the romance can be employed, as well as the death of Sir Roger, where Addison can use the tone of pathos. So my point, therefore, once again, remains that Addison's Spectator Papers is not, I would say, one style used across 555 essays. Obviously, you can well understand that two people were writing, so Addison and Steele were continuously interplaying in their sort of mutual styles and collaborations. But even for Addison, whose essays I have primarily taught in class, the essays become a kind of a compendium of contemporary literary styles. Okay, I've spoken a lot on the textual part of the essays. Now it's probably time to wind up the discussion by pointing out to the features that I discussed. So I have talked about the readership of Addison, the upper middle class readership. I've talked about, and therefore Addison cannot use a very lowly narrative style in the way that Fielding would probably do, or he cannot report in very colloquial phrases the happenings of society, which Defoe often does. Right. Therefore, Addison's style is much more, in tune with the audience that he interacts with. It is a civil, it is a style with a certain degree of sophistication and a class quality. The second thing is What is Addison's purpose? Addison's purpose is to bring philosophy out of closets, dwell in clubs and coffee houses. His purpose is to comment on social affairs unobtrusively. His purpose is to reform his audience from the rut they have fallen. His purpose is to create taste, yet his purpose is also to maintain a civil conversation and oversee the emergence of a civil public sphere. Therefore, for that, he seeks to take his reader into confidence. Therefore, he uses a confidential, a kind, not a confidential, a kind of a intimate style, as it were, without being very base. He uses a kind of a conversational tone of voice without allowing the essays to degenerate into mere conversations. He checks, he moves through formal introductions, narratives, and advisories, therefore modulating his style within same essays. And finally, what he does is also he creates a kind of a formal authority to the use of classical allusions, quotations. In his use of humor, Addison is always controlled. He allows the interplay of irony to add to the wit of the essays, yet he does not allow the irony to degenerate or the humor to degenerate into brutal satire. The entire purpose of this is to criticize the morals, the different aspects of society, but do so in a civil way so that a middle ground can be generated, an argument can be initiated which does not degenerate into a kind of a fight. So Addison's middle style is therefore suited to the entire purpose of creating the middle ground of a public civil society, a public sphere and a civil society. And it is therefore that he initiates a style that Dr. Johnson suggests is an ideal of the middle style. Now, I have pointed out, of course, that the Addison's middle style stands in between the very formal, very prescriptive style of Sir Francis Bacon and the very intimate, almost subjective style of Charles Lamb. So he brings the objectivity of Bacon and he brings in a subjective first person consciousness of Charles Lamb. He brings in the intimate narrative of Lamb, but balances it with the formal dictums of Sir Francis Bacon. So he walks historically also a kind of a middle ground. But that middle ground is important not because of itself. That middle ground is important because it can bring together the different elements of society together. It can advise as well as delight, and it can bring out difficult social, literary subjects and hand them out in simpler ways to a vast readership that is cultivating, a vast readership with which he has a relationship of interaction. To conclude, then, Addison's middle style is not a single style. It is a multiplicity of styles that combine the conversational and the prescriptive, the moral and the witty. It combines the humorous and the ironic with the praiseworthy, and it is therefore in this cultivation of the middle style that a middle kind of society, a civil public sphere, and a kind of bridge between the different segments of society can be generated. So I think therein lies the importance of Addison's middle style, as it were. So that was the first discussion which I intended to provide for my audience, let me take a quick sip of water before I move on to my next segment of discussion in this live stream. So that gives us a slight little break. Now, in the next part of this discussion, I will discuss how Addison seeks, or what is the functionality of the Spectator Papers in creating a public sphere and a civil society. These are the two terms that have been bandying around. Now, this, of course, can be asked to you in various ways. Now, what do you actually mean when you say Addison is enlivening morality with wit, tempering wit with morality? How does Addison represent society? How does he lead to the social public sphere? For this, let me get back to the concept of the public sphere itself. And that is a theoretical sort of leap which I'm making here. And the author, of course, whom I am bringing in is Jürgen Habermas and his very defined, almost landmark book called The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere. Now, Habermas, of course, when he talks about the public sphere, defines it, if you want the definition. The public sphere, and Habermas writes, may be conceived above all as the sphere of private people come together as a public, right? So private people, as we all are, when we are brought into a certain space, be it either actual or virtual, we form together a public sphere. And this public sphere soon claimed this space regulated from above against the public authorities themselves. So the public sphere demands a kind of an autonomy of forming public opinion and circulating public opinion, to engage in a debate over the general rules governing relations in the basically privatized but publicly relevant sphere of commodity exchange and social labor. Public sphere, therefore, is a significantly capitalistic phenomenon when the middle class feudal society has dissolved and individual rights of the public have emerged and commodity exchange has grown to a large extent. And it is here that a certain claim is made by the public over their own autonomy and agency. Right. So this is what Habermas suggests. Now, Habermas also suggests that we consider affairs public when they are open to all, and in contrast to closed or exclusive affairs. So no dictum from above, but opinion which is collaborated between the various segments of the populace. Now, Habermas, of course, suggests that there are certain conditions where public sphere can be formed. All citizens must have access to this public sphere. Now, the Spectator Papers were, of course, penny papers, so they could be accessed by most of the reading public. Additionally, they were being put up on the coffee houses. So they were very important spaces where a lot of people could have equal access to these papers. Also, Addison mentions the coffee house as a public sphere where people can spend a penny and enter and listen into any conversation. Right. The second concept of the public sphere is free and unrestricted speech or discussion, right? The freedom of expression and opinion about matters of general interest, talks about economic or freedom from economic and political control, and a debate about how society should govern itself or how human behavior should be moderated and modulated. Right. Now, the it's a very interesting turn of phrase that Hannah Arendt uses for the public sphere. She says rather that it is the common world that gathers us together and yet prevents our falling over each other. Right. So we have certain very key features here. One is disregard of status. Everybody is equal in the public sphere. A domain of social concern, that the public sphere discusses not individual or private matters, but matters which influence and and are relevant to all of us. The public sphere is inclusive, and therefore there are certain ways in which the public sphere, as it were, resists the hegemony of authority. At the same time, exchanging opinions within the public sphere can also lead to the formation of public opinion. Right? Now, it is this public opinion that Addison is talking about when he comes to the Spectator Papers. What does he want to do? And that is where essay number 10 becomes so fundamentally important. Addison repeatedly refers to man as a sociable animal, right? Man as the social animal is borrowing this, of course, from Aristotle's idea of politics. Now, this is the first idea. He says that whatever concerns the affairs of man is the business of the Spectator Papers, right? So he's right away pointing out that the Spectator's own affairs are not his concerns. And that is why the Spectator is silent, is an observer of human beings, and he is present in all places where there are human beings. So Addison is squarely and fairly, right at the beginning of the essays, alerting us to the fact that the Spectator Papers are not about private histories. They are about public affairs. And that is where he has created a group, a Spectator group, a club, which comprises of reasonably most of the classes of society, apart from the lower classes, who are not exactly his target audience. But he discusses their lives too. Nevertheless, he discusses poverty, he discusses the question of witchcraft and superstition. Remember, not private histories, but issues which are germane to the broader society as a whole. Right. Now, the third thing that he does, of course, is he then identifies certain very critical problems of society, which are common problems, which are deep-rooted problems, which have a dogmatic continuity over different periods. For example, as you've seen in Sir Roger at church, what should be the exact nature of the relationship between, the chaplain and the squire? What is the cause of superstition? How can such superstition be banished? What is the cause of witchcraft or the belief in witchcraft? Is this a sustainable or a rational belief? Right. So these are issues that Addison. What is the difference between country manners or country dressing and urban dressing? How does fashion travel from the city to the country? So these are certain very critical issues that are common to a large body of people. And therefore, Addison creates an almost Socratic kind of a space where he can allow the spectator to tower upon over society and observe it and record his judgments. But these judgments, unlike the conduct book, do not say people should do this, people should do that, and they are not directly prescriptive. Instead, what Addison does is that he creates a character and an anecdote. That is the importance of Sir Roger again. Sir Roger is that interface through which Addison can enter, not only Sir Roger, of course, Sir Andrew and the Spectator, interfaces through which Addison, the author, can enter into the public sphere. And he can create a small narrative, a small illustratory narrative, a narrative that illustrates his problem, right? So the behavior of Sir Roger, or the case of Moll White, who is generic, as it were, as in terms of the presence as a witch, as a supposed witch. So it creates an illustratory narrative. Now, this illustratory narrative hooks the audience or brings the audience to the Spectator Papers. They delight in this narrative. The tone, therefore, is conversational. The irony is there. The humor is there. The middle style sort of engages the audience within the narrative. And then, in the last part of the essay, Addison can then deliver his opinion, or he can sort of circulate a kind of a public opinion which may be followed by the rest of his readership, right? Therefore, he forms this opinion that the squire and the chaplain should be in a state of harmony. So the secular and the political, the secular and the religious organs of society can remain in harmony, or that, while there might be witchcraft, or it does not take away the entire belief in the supernatural, but common beliefs in witches are almost always driven by fear and animosity, and witches are really poor and mentally deranged rather than any harmful women. That, belief in superstitions and ghosts will always be there, but they can be, dissolved if the squire and the chaplain make an effort altogether. Now, note one very interesting thing. Addison does not say that superstition will vanish overnight, or that society will be changed overnight. He recognizes that deep-seated dogmatic assertions are very difficult to erase, and that the process will have to be gradual, and that new thought and philosophy will have to be brought in to counter this. And therefore, Addison is trying to create the spectator as a kind of a forward intellectual who knows his Locke, who knows his Hume, who knows his philosophy, who knows the classics, and who is therefore a kind of an anchor whose opinion can be valued in society. Now, this is therefore the creation of the forward intellectual who will be the vanguard of social opinion, as it were. And it is in this this judgment of the spectator, this mild advisory tone of the spectator, therefore, that the opinion of this public sphere is generated. And it is this opinion that will then, Addison writes in the 10th essay of the Spectator, elevate the vast majority of unthinking men into thinkers and philosophers, and thus, opinion, public opinion, wisdom will be dispersed from the clubs, from the libraries to the coffee houses. So it is therefore that Addison, through the narrative, through the wit, is creating an atmosphere through which the morality and the public opinion can be generated. Now, he is aware that he cannot be prescriptive like Bacon, and therefore he must allow interactions from the public as well. And therefore he opens up this ability to write directly to the spectator at the coffee house, and he will take up their assertions. So Addison is therefore maintaining that certain very important phenomenon. He's allowing access, not only in terms of money, but he's also allowing access in terms of a style which everybody can follow, right? He's allowing style in a conversational tone which everybody can participate in. So accessibility. Secondly, his essays are not private records of individual men. There might be, essays like Sir Roger in Love or The Dead Death of Sir Roger, which are one-off essays really. But in most of the essays, the narration is there to raise a certain social issue. And once this social issue has been raised, it is then that the essays can be functional in talking about general public affairs. Right. So he maintains the second condition of the public sphere. The third thing that we need to realize is that Addison is not only representing the public sphere, in creating the spectator as a figure of considerable moral authority and classical knowledge, is creating the forward intellectual who will then become the vanguard of public opinion and who will create and generate public opinion himself. Right? So the public sphere is not only represented, but the public sphere is also conditioned and thereby dispersed through the periodical essays. In all this, remember, in all this creation of the public sphere, please remember that Addison is careful not to take very rigid stances. His essays, therefore, cannot be extremely emphatic. They're always used in a discussion, conversational tone of voice. They're never emphatic in that they have that middle style within. And within this middle style, Addison can present both sides of the picture. He realizes that superstitions will be there, but he also realizes that if one brings in the rationality of Locke, and if one can combine the rationality of Locke with some sound common sense, and that is something which Sir Roger uses, the sound common sense, that these erroneous beliefs in society might ultimately be dissolved. Right. Therefore, Addison is not only representing a public sphere, is conditioning, is also initiating a kind of a civil public sphere where opinions coexist and where opinions can be conditioned and reformulated. Please remember that the Spectator Club is important in itself, not only because it represents the cross-section of society, but it also comprises within itself divergent political views, political social views, Whigs and Tories, Protestants and Catholics, cities and countries, both coexisting together in a state of harmony. It is this harmony then that Addison suggests is at the core of the civil public sphere, where exchange of public opinion can take place, where social opinions can be corrected, where dogma can be thrust away. Now, in 1700, or rather, I'm sorry, in 1800, Immanuel Kant will, of course, deliver and write his great essay called What Was the Enlightenment? And Immanuel Kant will suggest that enlightenment is freedom from dogma. And he will also suggest that enlightenment is marked by the public use of rationality. Right? Now, this public use of rationality is what Addison is seeking to cultivate almost 100 years earlier. If the Spectator starts in 1711, and if Kant publishes it in 1800, then it's almost 90 years or 89 years that Addison is seeking to create an atmosphere that is conducive to the public sphere or the public exercise of reason. Now, I will, of course, try and bring this and close this by referring once again to the physical public sphere, which Addison represents in the virtual public sphere. And I'll once again go back to that 49th essay of The Spectator. Now, in the 49th essay of The Spectator, as I said, it is a secret, he says. Addison is talking about the actual coffee house where different people come at different parts of the day to profess their views and listen to each other's views. He says We are very curious to observe the behavior of great men and their clients. But the same passions and interests move men in lower spheres, that in every parish, street, lane, and alley of this populous city. So, yes, not only do we follow the great men, but also the men of the lower class also are inclined to follow public opinion if it is generated by the intellectuals. Right. So there is, of course, then the figure of Ebullus that Addison creates. Ebullus is the protagonist of the coffee house. He is well read, he has opinions on most social issues. So Ebullus presides over the middle hours of the day, enjoys a great fortune handsomely, and exerts every useful and noble qualities without appearing in any public employment. His wisdom and knowledge are serviceable. He does the office of a counsel, a judge, an executor, and a friend to all acquaintances, not only without the profits which attend such offices, but also without the deference and homage which are usually paid to him. The greatest gratitude you can shew him is to let him see you are a better man for his services. So, this is the well read intellectual who can offer his opinion and formulate public opinion without any ulterior profit or purpose. And the greatest, compliment one can pay to him is to tell him that one has been benefited by him. He does not consider, Addison writes, in whose hands his money will improve most, but where it will do most good. So, this classical intellectual of the public sphere is one who will not merely consider how much money he makes, but how much good happens to society. Now, can you see Ebullus as Addison, or can you see Addison as the Ebullus of the Spectator Papers? You see, both the both the Spectator Papers and the coffee houses are variants of the same public sphere where opinion is formulated on social issues and where agreeable conversation is made, where people's opinions are created and changed and transformed, right? In an atmosphere of discussion over a cup of coffee or over a cup of tea, as the Spectator says, early in the morning. Therefore, it is this that Addison wants to do through the Spectator Papers. He seeks to generate a social morality, but does so with a witty narrative. He wants to transform society into civility and proper public good and welfare, but he wants to do that without any ostentatious kind of advisement. And it is here, therefore, that the Spectator Papers become the vehicles for the formulation and the articulation of a new public sphere on matters political, cultural, literary, and so on and so forth, where Addison can bring philosophy out of closets and libraries, where Addison can provide or attempt to improve the race from the rut they have fallen into, and where Addison can bring together these questions about morality and wit. It is therefore that the Spectator Papers becomes one of the very important constituents in the formation and development of the 18th century public sphere. Right. So today we have completed our assignment in Addison Square for the class. We've discussed in our earlier lecture the question about the role of the spectator. We've talked about the role of the public, of the Spectator Club. We've talked about how Addison can bring philosophy out of closets. We've talked about how Addison enlivens morality with wit. in the formation of the public sphere and the relationship of the Spectator Papers with the rise of the early print public sphere in England. And finally, we have also taken a look, very close look, at the way in which the uh, the operative middle style of Addison is eminently suitable to the readership and the purpose of the Spectator Papers. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having been part of this live stream. It is with this, therefore, I bring the discussion of the Spectator Papers to a close. Our next assignment shall be something of a different track altogether, and we'll be moving away from this paper for some time. And I will be discussing Romanticism, the key features of Romanticism, through the visual representations of Romanticism, the paintings of the period. That will be my next assignment. And what I'll be doing there is bringing together the visual, the musical, and also the literary, in the ways in which different poets of the period articulate their theoretical concerns about poetry. We'll be discussing Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, and Shelley, and in the ways in which they look at how Romanticism was articulating their subjectivities. And we'll also look at the representations in the visuals and the paintings, and therefore see how Romanticism, or what the major facets of Romanticism take place, or what the major facets of Romanticism are. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is reserved for a different class as of today. Thank you for having listened to this live stream, and have a very good day. It is with that, therefore, that I end this broadcast for the time being.